You can tell a lot about a person by the car they drive. That was the sentence that made the entire room laugh, and it was aimed directly at me. I heard it the moment I stepped out of my old silver sedan and closed the driver's side door. The parking lot outside the Grand Harbor Conference Center was filled with luxury SUVs, imported sports cars, and shiny executive sedans that looked like they had rolled straight out of a commercial. My car looked completely out of place among them. A few people glanced in my direction, then exchanged amused smiles before walking inside. I had been invited to the annual Business Networking Gala, an event that attracted entrepreneurs, investors, and local executives from across the state. Years ago, I attended these events regularly. Then I disappeared. At least, that was what most people believed. The truth was much more complicated. As I adjusted my jacket and headed toward the entrance, I spotted Brandon Mitchell standing near the registration table. Brandon had always been the loudest man in any room. He loved attention, loved recognition, and most of all, loved reminding people about his success. The moment he saw me, his eyebrows lifted in surprise. Then came the smile. Not the kind smile of an old acquaintance. The kind that appears when someone thinks they have found an easy target. "Ethan Carter," he said loudly enough for several people nearby to hear. "Well, this is unexpected." A few heads turned toward us. I smiled and shook his hand. "Good to see you, Brandon." His eyes drifted toward the parking lot behind me. "Still driving that old thing?" A few people chuckled. Some people never move forward, I guess. More laughter followed. I simply smiled. Over the years, I had learned that silence often revealed more about people than arguments ever could. Brandon seemed disappointed that I didn't react. He wanted a performance. Instead, I signed my name at the registration desk and collected my name badge. As I walked into the ballroom, I could feel the familiar energy of the event. Conversations about investments, acquisitions, real estate, and market trends floated through the air. Waitstaff carried trays of appetizers, while groups formed around high-top tables. Everywhere I looked, people were comparing accomplishments. Who had expanded? Who had sold? Who had bought? Who had won? I listened quietly. Nobody asked what I had been doing during the last few years. Most assumed they already knew the answer. In their minds, a man arriving in a 15-year-old sedan couldn't possibly have a story worth hearing. What none of them knew was that 72 hours earlier, I had signed the final document on the biggest deal of my life. After years of long nights, endless setbacks, and sacrifices nobody had witnessed, the company I built from a tiny rented office had been acquired. The number on the contract was $35 million. And not a single person in that ballroom had any idea. For the next hour, I moved through the ballroom almost unnoticed. That was not entirely true. People noticed me, but only in the way people notice furniture. They saw me standing there, yet nobody seemed interested in learning why I had come. Small groups formed and dissolved around the room as conversations shifted from business opportunities to investment portfolios and luxury vacations. Every discussion seemed to become a competition. Someone had purchased a larger house. Someone else had doubled the value of a commercial property. Another person talked about buying a new yacht for weekends along the coast. I listened politely whenever I was included, which was rare. Most of the time, people glanced at my name badge, searched their memory, and quickly moved on to someone they considered more important. Across the room, Brandon appeared to be enjoying himself. He had gathered a crowd around a table near the center of the ballroom. Every few minutes laughter erupted from the group. Brandon always understood how to become the center of attention. As the evening continued, he became louder and more confident. Eventually, our paths crossed again near the refreshment area. He looked me up and down before smiling. "So what have you been up to all these years, Ethan?" he asked. Before I could answer, he added, "Actually, never mind. If things were going well, I suppose we would have heard about it." Several people nearby laughed. I smiled calmly. "I have been busy." Brandon nodded dramatically. Busy is good. Busy usually means there is hope. More laughter followed. I noticed a few people looking uncomfortable, but none of them said anything. That was often how these situations worked. Most people preferred to stay on the side of whoever seemed successful. Brandon interpreted my silence as weakness. In reality, I simply had no interest in competing with him. The older I became, the less I felt the need to prove anything. After Brandon walked away, I found a quiet corner near one of the large windows overlooking the city skyline. The lights from downtown stretched across the horizon, reminding me of the nights when my company was nothing more than a dream. There had been years when I slept on an office couch because I could not afford an apartment close to work. Years when payroll mattered more than my own paycheck. Years when investors said no. Years when competitors dismissed us completely. None of those people were laughing now, but none of the people in this ballroom knew that story. To them, I was simply the man who drove an old car. As I stood there reflecting, the ballroom doors opened and a new guest entered. The atmosphere shifted almost immediately. Conversations paused. Heads turned. Several people straightened their posture. Whoever had just arrived clearly mattered. I watched as the distinguished older gentleman greeted a few organizers before slowly scanning the room. Then his eyes stopped. He was looking directly at me. For a brief moment, surprise crossed his face. Then a wide smile appeared, and he began walking in my direction while dozens of curious eyes followed him across the room. The gentleman crossed the ballroom with a confidence that immediately commanded attention. Conversation softened as people watched him move through the crowd. I recognized him instantly. His name was Robert Langford, a respected investor whose opinion carried weight in almost every major business circle in the region. We had worked together years earlier when my company was still fighting for survival. Back then, very few people believed in what we were building. Robert had been one of the exceptions. When he finally reached me, his smile widened. "Ethan Carter," he said, extending his hand. "I was hoping that was really you." I shook his hand. "Good to see you again, Robert." Several nearby guests suddenly became interested in our conversation. A moment earlier, most of them had barely noticed I existed. Now they were listening carefully. Robert laughed warmly. "You have no idea how surprised I am to see you standing here." Before I could answer, he continued. "Actually, surprised is the wrong word. Impressed is probably more accurate." I noticed Brandon looking in our direction from across the room. The confident expression he had worn all evening seemed to fade slightly. Robert turned toward a few people standing nearby. "Do you all know Ethan?" he asked. One woman shrugged politely. Another man admitted he did not. Robert looked genuinely shocked. "That is incredible." More people began drifting closer. Human curiosity has a way of spreading through a room faster than any announcement. Within minutes, a small crowd had formed around us. Brandon eventually walked over as well, clearly trying to understand why one of the most respected guests at the event was speaking to me with such enthusiasm. "Robert," Brandon said, forcing a smile, "you know Ethan." Robert looked at him. "Know him?" "Of course I know him." He turned back toward me. "The last time I saw Ethan, he was building one of the most promising technology companies I had encountered in years." Several people exchanged surprised looks. Brandon remained silent. Robert continued speaking, completely unaware of the earlier jokes that had been made at my expense. "I still remember those meetings. Most people thought the idea was too ambitious. They said the market was crowded. They said the odds were impossible." He laughed. "Looks like they were wrong." The room had become noticeably quieter. I could feel dozens of eyes moving between Robert and me. Some guests appeared confused. Others looked skeptical. After all, the version of me they had created in their minds did not match the story they were now hearing. Robert glanced at me. "You never were the type to seek attention, were you?" I smiled. I have always preferred focusing on the work. That has not changed, he replied. Then he shook his head in disbelief. You know, there are people in this room talking all night about success. Meanwhile, one of the most remarkable business stories I have seen in the last decade is standing right here by the window acting like a regular guest. The crowd grew larger. Brandon said nothing. For the first time that evening, nobody was laughing anymore. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The energy in the ballroom had completely changed. Earlier, people had been eager to share their own accomplishments. Now they were waiting to hear more about mine. It was a strange thing to witness. The same room that had ignored me for most of the evening suddenly seemed fascinated by my presence. Robert glanced around at the growing crowd and smiled. You know what impressed me most about Ethan? He asked. Nobody answered. It was never the technology. It was never the business plan. It was his persistence. Several guests nodded politely. Robert continued. I remember sitting across from him years ago when things were not easy. Most entrepreneurs talk about commitment when everything is going well. Ethan kept showing up when nothing was going well. I appreciated the compliment, but the attention made me slightly uncomfortable. I had spent years focusing on work rather than recognition. Being placed at the center of a room was never something I enjoyed. Brandon finally broke the silence. I had no idea you two worked together, he said. Robert looked at him. Quite closely at one point. Brandon forced a small laugh. Well, Ethan always kept to himself. Robert smiled. That is because he was busy building something. The answer landed harder than any criticism could have. Several people who had laughed earlier now seemed interested in changing the subject. One woman asked about market conditions. Another asked about emerging technology trends. The conversation gradually shifted, but the atmosphere never returned to what it had been before. I noticed people studying me differently. Not because I looked different. Not because I had changed my clothes. Not because I had arrived in a different vehicle. The only thing that had changed was the story they believed about me. That realization was always fascinating. A person could remain exactly the same while public perception transformed in an instant. Robert and I spent several minutes discussing industry developments. During the conversation, he mentioned a few recent projects and asked about my future plans. I answered carefully without revealing too much. The acquisition was still fresh. In many ways, I had not fully processed it myself. Years of effort had suddenly become one completed chapter. Before I could decide what came next, someone from the event staff approached Robert and informed him that several sponsors wanted to speak with him. He apologized and prepared to leave. Before walking away, he placed a hand on my shoulder. Do not disappear tonight, he said with a grin. There are a lot of people here who should probably hear your story. Then he moved into the crowd. As soon as he left, something even more interesting happened. People who had barely acknowledged me earlier began approaching one after another. Some introduced themselves. Others suddenly remembered meeting me years ago. A few even acted as though we had been friends all along. Across the room, Brandon watched the scene unfold. His confident smile was gone. For the first time that evening, he looked uncertain. And although nobody knew it yet, the biggest surprise of the night had not even been revealed. The next 20 minutes felt like a completely different event. People who had spent the entire evening talking about themselves were suddenly asking questions and listening carefully to the answers. A few wanted to know about market trends. Others asked about entrepreneurship, leadership, and business growth. I answered politely, but I kept most responses brief. Years of experience had taught me that genuine curiosity and opportunistic interest often looked similar at first. One conversation blended into another until I eventually found myself standing near a table with several local business owners. The discussion focused on economic uncertainty and the challenges of growing a company during changing market conditions. Unlike some of the earlier conversations, this one felt authentic. These people were sharing real concerns rather than competing for attention. For the first time that evening, I actually enjoyed myself. Then Brandon appeared again. This time, his approach was noticeably different. The confidence that had fueled his earlier jokes had been replaced by caution. He joined the group with a friendly smile and asked a few questions about the discussion. Nobody mentioned what had happened earlier, but the memory lingered in the air. Brandon glanced toward me several times before finally speaking. "Robert clearly thinks highly of you," he said. "That means you must have been working on something interesting." I smiled. "I have been busy." Several people around us laughed softly. Not because the comment was funny, but because they recognized the answer. Earlier in the evening, Brandon had used the same phrase to dismiss me. Now it carried a different meaning. Brandon forced a chuckle. "Fair enough." Before the conversation could continue, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I glanced at the screen and immediately recognized the number. It was one of the attorneys who had helped finalize the acquisition. I stepped away from the group and moved toward a quieter hallway outside the ballroom. The call lasted only a few minutes. We reviewed several administrative details related to the transaction and discussed a few remaining signatures that would be completed the following week. It was a routine conversation. Nothing dramatic. Nothing extraordinary. Yet I noticed two guests passing through the hallway slow their pace when they overheard part of the discussion. I paid little attention and returned to the ballroom after ending the call. What I did not realize was that one of those guests happened to work in corporate finance. He recognized the company name mentioned during the call. More importantly, he recognized it from a recent industry report that had attracted significant attention. Back inside the ballroom, conversations continued as normal. However, small changes were beginning to occur. Whispers traveled between tables. Curious glances became more frequent. A few people checked their phones. Others exchanged puzzled expressions. I remained unaware of most of it. I was speaking with a retired executive about leadership lessons when I noticed Robert walking back toward the center of the room. This time, he was accompanied by several influential guests. They seemed excited about something. As they approached, the volume of conversations throughout the ballroom gradually decreased. One by one, people turned to see what was happening. The room was about to learn a detail that would change the entire evening, and there would be no way to take it back once it was spoken aloud. Robert stopped near the center of the ballroom and exchanged a few words with the guest standing beside him. I could see curiosity spreading throughout the room. Whatever had started as a quiet rumor was no longer staying quiet. One of the men accompanying Robert was a well-known corporate attorney. Another was a financial advisor who regularly worked on major acquisitions. Their presence alone attracted attention. I remained where I was, hoping the focus would move elsewhere. It did not. A moment later, the financial advisor looked directly at me. His eyes widened slightly, as if he had finally confirmed something that seemed impossible only minutes earlier. "Wait a second," he said. "You are Ethan Carter." I smiled politely. "Yes." He shook his head in disbelief. "The Ethan Carter." Several people nearby exchanged confused looks. Someone asked what he meant. The advisor laughed softly. "I cannot believe nobody has connected the dots yet." The room grew quieter. Conversation slowed. More guests turned toward us. Brandon stood only a few feet away, listening carefully. The advisor continued speaking. 3 days ago, one of the largest private acquisitions in the technology sector closed. A few people immediately recognized what he was referring to. Others looked curious. The founder sold the company after building it for more than a decade. The deal attracted attention all over the industry. Robert smiled knowingly but said nothing. The advisor looked directly at me again. That founder was Ethan Carter. For a moment, absolute silence filled the ballroom. It was the kind of silence that only appears when a room full of people suddenly realizes they have misunderstood something important. Several guests stared at me. Others looked at Brandon. A woman near the refreshment table slowly lowered her glass. Another guest pulled out his phone and began searching. Within seconds, confirmation appeared on multiple screens across the room. The information was public. The transaction had been reported by several business publications earlier that week. There was nothing secret about it anymore except the fact that nobody in this ballroom had connected my name to the headlines. The advisor continued. From what I understand, the final valuation was around $35 million. A few audible gasps broke the silence. Someone whispered, 35 million. Another person repeated the number as if saying it aloud would somehow make it easier to believe. I remained calm. The number sounded no different to me than it had during the signing. After years of work, it represented a completed journey, not a trophy. Yet to everyone else in the room, it changed everything. Faces that had shown indifference earlier now reflected admiration. People who had overlooked me suddenly seemed eager to remember every interaction we had ever shared. Brandon stood completely still. Earlier in the evening, he had been the most confident person in the ballroom. Now he looked like a man trying to replay every conversation in his head. The irony was impossible to miss. Nothing about me had changed since I walked through the doors. I was wearing the same suit. I was standing in the same room. My old sedan was still parked outside. The only thing that had changed was what people believed about me, and that realization was making everyone uncomfortable. The silence lasted only a few seconds before the room exploded into conversation. Everywhere I looked, people were speaking in hushed voices, checking articles on their phones, and comparing information they had just discovered. The transformation was remarkable. Earlier that evening, many of those same people had treated me like an afterthought. Now they seemed eager to be associated with me in some way. One guest approached to congratulate me. Then another. Soon a small line of people had formed, each wanting a moment of conversation. Some offered compliments about the company. Others praised the acquisition. A few spoke as if they had always believed in me, even though I could not remember speaking with them before. Through it all, I remained polite. Success had taught me an important lesson. The way people treat you after they learn your accomplishments often reveals just as much as the way they treated you before. Robert stood nearby, observing everything with an amused expression. He understood exactly what was happening. He had spent decades in business and had seen similar scenes countless times. The difference was that this time I was standing in the center of it. Across the ballroom, Brandon remained unusually quiet. Several people who had been laughing alongside him earlier now seemed careful to keep their distance. Nobody wanted to be associated with the wrong side of the story. Eventually, Brandon made his way toward me. The crowd parted slightly as he approached. His confident swagger had disappeared completely. When he reached me, he offered a smile that looked more nervous than friendly. "Ethan," he said, "I have to admit, I am impressed." I nodded politely. "Thank you." He glanced around before continuing. "You could have mentioned all of this earlier." I smiled. "You never asked." A few people nearby exchanged looks. Brandon laughed awkwardly. "Fair point." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he cleared his throat. "Honestly, I had no idea." "I know," I replied. The answer was simple, but it seemed to carry more weight than a longer explanation ever could. Brandon looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. "If anything I said earlier came across the wrong way, I hope you know it was just joking around." I could tell he wanted the conversation to end differently. He wanted reassurance. He wanted the awkwardness to disappear. But the truth was that no apology could erase what had happened. The comments themselves were not the real issue. The real issue was the assumption behind them. I smiled politely. "Do not worry about it." Relief immediately appeared on his face. Yet as he walked away, I noticed something interesting. He seemed far more uncomfortable than I was. The evening continued, but the dynamic of the room had permanently changed. People were no longer discussing what car someone drove or what watch someone wore. They were talking about perseverance, entrepreneurship, and long-term success. Ironically, the very topics that mattered most had only become interesting after they were attached to a large number. As I looked around the ballroom, I realized the night was teaching everyone the same lesson, whether they admitted it or not. As the evening moved forward, the crowd around me never fully disappeared. Every few minutes, someone new introduced themselves or asked a question. Some wanted advice about launching a business. Others were curious about the acquisition process. A few seemed more interested in the number attached to the deal than the years of work behind it. I answered respectfully, but I found myself thinking about something else entirely. Earlier that evening, nobody had cared about my story. Now everyone wanted to hear it. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Robert eventually joined me again near one of the large windows overlooking the city. He smiled as he watched another group approach before deciding to give us space. "Looks like you became the most popular person in the room," he said. I laughed. "For tonight, maybe." He nodded. "Enjoy it while it lasts." We both knew popularity based on success could be temporary. Respect built on character lasted much longer. Before I could respond, a young entrepreneur stepped forward and asked what I considered the most important factor behind long-term success. It was probably the most sincere question I had heard all evening. I thought about it for a moment before answering. The ability to keep going when nobody believes in you. The young man nodded thoughtfully. Several others listened carefully. "Most people see the final result," I continued. "They do not see the years before that. They do not see the setbacks, the uncertainty, or the moments when quitting would have been easier." For the first time all evening, the room seemed interested in something deeper than money. The conversation shifted toward perseverance, discipline, and personal growth. People shared stories about failures that eventually became valuable lessons. The atmosphere felt more genuine than it had at any point earlier in the night. Meanwhile, Brandon remained on the edge of the crowd. He spoke with a few guests but rarely joined the larger discussions. I noticed him looking in my direction several times. Not with resentment, but with the expression of someone reconsidering his assumptions. Eventually he approached one final time. This conversation felt different from the previous one. There was no performance. No audience. No attempt to impress anyone. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course." He hesitated for a moment. "Why did you never say anything?" I already knew what he meant. "About the company." He nodded. "About all of it." I smiled. "Because it never seemed necessary." Brandon looked genuinely puzzled. "Most people would have told everyone." "Maybe," I said. "But I built the company to create something meaningful, not to win arguments." He stared at me for a moment before slowly nodding. The answer seemed to affect him more than he expected. When he walked away, I sensed that he understood something important. Success was not always loud. Sometimes it arrived quietly after years of invisible effort. Sometimes the people who appeared ordinary were carrying extraordinary stories. As the event began winding down, guests gradually collected their coats and prepared to leave. Yet many of them continued discussing the same lesson that had unexpectedly shaped the entire evening. Appearances could be misleading. Assumptions could be expensive. And sometimes the most successful person in the room was the one nobody bothered to understand. By the time the event finally came to an end, the ballroom looked very different from when I had arrived. Most of the guests had already left, and the conversations that remained were quieter and more reflective. People exchanged handshakes, collected business cards, and said their goodbyes. Several guests stopped to thank me for sharing parts of my journey. Others wished me luck in whatever came next. I appreciated the kind words, but I knew the most valuable part of the evening had nothing to do with congratulations. It had everything to do with perspective. As I walked toward the exit, Robert caught up with me one last time. "You handled tonight well," he said. "I tried." He smiled. Most people would have enjoyed proving everyone wrong. I looked toward the parking lot through the glass doors. Maybe when I was younger. Robert laughed. That is probably why you succeeded. We shook hands, and he headed toward his driver waiting outside. I stepped into the cool night air and took a deep breath. The city lights stretched across the horizon, and for the first time all evening, everything felt quiet. A few guests were still leaving the building. Some waved as they passed. Others nodded respectfully. Among them was Brandon. He walked over slowly, no audience around him this time. Before you go, he said, I wanted to say something. I waited. Tonight made me realize how quickly people judge each other. He looked embarrassed. Including me. I nodded. We all do it sometimes. He smiled faintly. Maybe. But I think I got a lesson I needed. There was honesty in his voice now. Not because of the acquisition. Not because of the money. Because for a few hours he had been forced to see the difference between appearance and reality. We shook hands, and he wished me well. Then he walked toward his vehicle and disappeared into the night. I continued across the parking lot until I reached my old silver sedan. Under the parking lot lights, it looked exactly as it had when I arrived. The paint showed signs of age. The design was outdated. It would never attract attention among luxury vehicles. Yet as I unlocked the door, I found myself smiling. Most people at the event assumed I kept the car because I could not afford something newer. The truth was much simpler. It was the first car I bought after my father passed away. At the time, I had almost no money. I was working long hours, chasing a dream that seemed impossible to everyone except me. Every major milestone in my life had happened with that car nearby. It carried me to investor meetings. It carried me to my first office. It carried me through years of uncertainty and doubt. Replacing it never felt important. I sat behind the wheel and looked through the windshield for a moment before starting the engine. The events of the evening replayed in my mind. The laughter. The assumptions. The surprise. The apologies. In the end, none of those things mattered as much as the lesson behind them. Success does not change who you are. It reveals who other people think you are. And sometimes the most valuable thing you can own is not the money you earn or the recognition you receive. Sometimes it is the ability to remain yourself before the world applauds and after it stops. With that thought, I shifted into drive and headed home, leaving behind a room full of people who would never look at ordinary things quite the same way again.